I think I was very lucky because as I grew up and my mother again encouraged us, was to try doing different things and new things all the time. I mean, my story about wine is a classic example. She said, Douglas, now wine is not an alcoholic beverage. Wine is what is a complement to good food. And I've always thought of it that way, and I've never thought of it as an alcoholic beverage, and that I think is the right way to think about wine. And she always was thinking things like that for me, so she had a big influence in making me think for myself.
Have you ever regretted that you became an economist and not a photographer?
Oh, yes. I think I'd have been a better photographer than an economist. And I don't know whether you know this story, but when I was thinking about it, the two people who were influential were an economist who was a professor of economics and his wife who was the photographer. And I would go there for dinner because I was working with the photographer, and they both tried to persuade me to become an economist or a photographer, and the economist won, but I think I made a mistake.
Why do you think so?
I think I was a better photographer.
But you have been doing photography as well.
Oh yeah, but just on the side, not as a way of life. But I've often wondered what it would have been like if I'd stuck to photography.
So how do people make choices? How did you make that choice?
Well, you know, I've thought a lot about that, and I don't think it was very rational. I didn't weigh up all of the advantages of being one or being the other. I think I was influenced just by a lot of immediate things that struck me as important. And at that time, I was very impressed that economists were a very influential group in the world, and I could save the world. And I had some illusion that I could save the world, and so I became an economist. I haven't saved the world, as you may well notice.
Yeah, but you have still many years to go.
A few years ago, yes.
Networks are of course important when you're doing science. Do you think the way we communicate and with the internet that this has changed in some way?
People have a chance to evolve more rapidly in a world where you have low-cost information of that kind. It's a negative in the sense that they get all kinds of other influences, some of which may be deleterious, including becoming, bandits and outlaws and what are very common today. And I'm not too optimistic when I see what's happening today that the influence of rapid change like that is all good.
You've been trying to ask this question for many years, so I will post it. Why do some countries become rich and others remain poor?
Well, I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. And I think that's very important because the fumbling and bumbling we do around the world trying to improve lots have traditionally not had much help. In fact, the World Bank that I've been an advisor to did a survey of the first 100 billion they'd spent on trying to improve things, and they came to the conclusion they hadn't had any effect. Maybe a slight exaggeration, but I think that's probably true. It's a complex thing what makes for economic development, economic growth. We know some things. We certainly know that education, improving a lot of varieties of things, morality and so on, are important. But how we put them all together and can do it ahead of time, and when people take credit for the fact that a country's good, I think they're full of baloney.
So, can we have continued economic growth without affecting the natural resources and the climate?
Well, Israel did it without having much in the way of resources and so on, and so I think, yes, I don't think that being rich in resources, I think that you have to have imaginative and creative people, how to get people to be imaginative and creative and so on is something that we think we have clues about, but we don't really know how to do it.
What do you think is humanity's greatest challenge?
Surviving. I think that one of the things that we are not understanding enough about is that we've evolved so rapidly with enormous productive potential and potential for destroying people that I'm not sure we're keeping up with it. And I think that's scary. I think that the world we've developed now is one that is a frightening world.
What is your source of inspiration?
Well, I've known a lot of very impressive people in my life. And I'm not talking just about my mother, but about a lot of people that I thought were inspirational and thoughtful, and they've had a big influence on me. I was just thinking about the other day because one of them just died the other time. David Morris was his name. He and I started out, we were undergraduates together at Berkeley. We went off in different directions in World War II and came back and went back to graduate school together to Berkeley. And then we moved to the University of Washington together. And Maury was always a big influence on my life. And yet, very interestingly, he didn't have a big influence on the rest of the world. He was always in the circle I knew as graduate students. He was the leader of all the graduate students always. And yet somehow or other, after he got out, he didn't have as much influence. But he had an enormous influence on me, and I was always very impressed with him.
You've been working a lot with the role of institutions. Could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Well, one of the things that makes me mad about economists in the world is that economists think that the world works automatically without all just knowledge and information is all you have. But creating an incentive structure that works, that makes people do things, is enormously complex. And so when I first became interested in institutions, it seemed to me that was the key to what made them work. And then you had to figure out what made institutions effective. And I've spent much of the last 30 years trying to figure out how to make institutions more effective and how to direct them to do things that would improve society. And I think that we still have a long ways to go, but institutions are the key to understanding how to structure human interrelationships in ways that will make it so that it will work better or worse for that matter.
I would like to come back to how people make choices. You told us about how you made your choice, but in general, people's choice are very important for the societies.
Well, economics is a theory of choice. That's what economics is all about. And so it's at the core, really, of what we think we're doing. And to give you a good answer to that, you've got to go back to something we know still much too little about, which is how the mind and brain interpret from the senses, eyes, ears, nose, and feelings, how those stimuli go to your brain, and how your brain then structures them to make sense out of them. And that's the $64 question, because if we knew, now we have some clues about it, and indeed cognitive science is all about that. And I've spent a lot of the last 15 years trying to understand cognitive science and working as an amateur with people who are neurologists and so on. There's a long ways, we're a long ways from understanding it. But clearly it's at the very heart of what we need to understand if we understand how we make the world work and how to make it work better.
Thank you, Professor Norris, for giving this interview and for joining us. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.